I told my sons that I'm going to be preaching through two chapters in the book of Genesis. So they are bracing for like 2 hours of a sermon, but um, I'm not going to be able to do that. I do want you to realize as we look at chapter 18 today, and we'll only look at the first portion of it, the first half of it. Chapters 18 and 19, they go together. And so we're going to be advanced in the book of Genesis that is leading us along. How is God bringing his his people back to a garden-like place where God will dwell with man and man will enjoy God's presence forever. And we have learned it's going to be through a son that is given to Abraham. You might remember that in chapter 17, we were able to see that this was signified through a sign that was given to Abraham in circumcision. And thus God provided an outward means by which there was a visible way that people could, in that sense, point out who are God's people in the world. When we come to chapter 18, we're going to see that God now is going to come and visit Abraham. And he's going to eat with him. So the sign that we see in circumcision is followed now by a communion or fellowship meal with Abraham and these three guests from heaven. Both of which, Christian, I would just want us to say that God likes patterns. And one of the patterns that pervades God's work and his redemptive people are these two ordinances. There's an outward sign of who actually is incorporated into God's redeemed people, and there is another outward sign that marks them as continuing in this communion with God. And so let's look at chapter 18, and we will see that these visitors from heaven have something to indeed teach Abraham and his wife Sarah. That's going to do something for us that is helpful. And this is sort of something that we need to learn as we are reading the Bible, as we're thinking about the Christian faith, thinking about our knowledge of God. Church history has there's two people. We have Augustine and then we have Aquinas, and they said things that are, in one sense, they complement one another, but they actually seem to be contrary to one another. Augustine said, I believe, therefore I know. And Aquinas said, I know, therefore I believe. Now, I would definitely want you to put the starter with Augustine. You cannot know God until you trust God. But Aquinas is helpful, and that is so long as that we approach God with faith, we're going to learn from God, and what God teaches us about him, we then are going to trust. There's, in one sense, a two-lane road, so to speak. Well, there's some questions that are going to be asked in chapter 18 that are fundamental questions that we have about God. The question that we will have asked by God himself this morning is there anything too difficult for God? The next week, the question will be, will you punish the righteous along with the wicked? Now, those are the two questions, but I want you to see God addresses these questions not because he says, okay, all of my critics, I'm going to let you come to your sort of man-made courtroom and I'll come up on the stand and you and your finite fallenness are going to be able to judge me. That's not how God answers these questions. God answers these questions in covenant relationship with his redeemed people, whereby now he shows what he is like and therefore comes to answer these questions. So I would point you first to Augustine. The way that you are going to learn answers to your questions about God, as significant as they are, is by first trusting in him. Then you may know. But let's start here with Abraham in Genesis 18. In verse 1, we're going to see what is unique to Abraham. We read, "Then Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day." This is giving us some detailed information that we need to know. We know the person, we know the place, and we know the time. This is, in one sense, very close to where it all started between God and Yahweh. Just outside of Hebron, there are these oaks that have been a meeting place. And there, Abram is sitting at his tent. So this is in the land God has promised to Abram. It is, like some of you know, it is after lunch. And in very hot places, what do they wisely do after lunch? They have a siesta. Now, I was privileged to work with my grandfather and my father and great uncles and uncles, and we did glorious, sophisticated work. We had hogs and chickens. And we would go and we would work, and we had to do the initial duties, and then we would go to my grandmother's house and she would cook. And then after we ate, guess what we did? My grandfather would sit back in his lazy boy and he would prop his feet up and he would turn on generally like C-SPAN, and we would take a little siesta. That's Thomas siesta for you. All right. You can see other cultures have their own. But the point is this is the time of the day when Abraham, they have finished the chores that come in the middle of the day. They have had their midday meal, and he is resting in his tent. And verse 2 tells us, he lifts up his eyes and he looked, and behold, 3 men were standing nearby. He saw, and he ran from the tent door to meet them, and he bowed himself to the earth, and he said, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and let me bring a piece of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass on, since in such a manner you have passed by your servant." And they said, "So you shall do as you have said." Now here there might be a little different. In rural communities tend to have this practice still apart, but even other places in the world still have this as a cultural expectation. Abraham had an expectation to be hospitable to people who would come through his area. If you came through his land, in one sense, it's either your friend or foe. But hospitality would be extended to you before that would be known. And so Abraham does what is the cultural accepted norm. He provides hospitality for these 3 men. Now, I would want us to remind ourselves in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, we are commanded to also be hospitable. Which, just in case you're wondering, when the Bible picks up something that may be accented in other cultures in a way that is different or more significant than our own culture, and then it drops it down by way of a command to the church, that now becomes one of our norms. Do you understand? Hospitality, like we will see Abraham here provide for these 3 men, is not something of the ancient Near Eastern ways, but is also something that is of the transcendent behavior of the church. And that's why in that verse in Hebrews, we're told, because if you're hospitable, you may actually entertain angels unaware. See, what Abraham thinks these 3 individuals to be is he thinks that they are men, right? That's what the text tells us. Moses tells us that Abram's understanding of his action are these are three men. They're passing by my land and my tent, and therefore I am going to be hospitable to these men. Where we're going to see these men are going to slowly reveal their identity. But Moses is going to, indeed, we're able to know what's going on. Verse 1 told us, right? Yahweh appeared. Yahweh appeared. This raises the question, how would Abraham actually meet Yahweh and whoever these other two men are and not know that this is Yahweh? And we'll come to see as we go forward into Genesis 19, two of those men, after this meeting with Abraham, after this visit is finished, two of these men go on to Sodom and do what they have come to do. And we find out they're not men, they're actually hosts or angels sent by God to bring judgment upon Sodom. So not only do we have this question of like, well, how would Abraham actually meet Yahweh and not know that it's Yahweh? And how would he meet angels and not know that they're angels? That's what entertaining angels unaware is. You didn't realize they were angels. Now, is there an answer in the text? There's not an answer. That's the quick answer. There's not an answer. There's not an explanation. However, inferences we might need to be able to make. I think, and again, it's not explicit in the text, but I think that what is happening here is this is the pre-incarnate Son of God that is coming and actually walking on the earth, not in his incarnate body, but in a pre-incarnate form. And thus, in every way, Abraham is looking at him and he seems to be a man. These two other men, these angels we will come to learn, they are also able to take a form that conceals their angelic nature. Now, this can be helpful for sort of modern American Western people. We think like, that's crazy. And I'm just going to say, here's your choices, church. You can say, okay, the Bible presents this to be reality, and I am taught from finite men, that's crazy. Well, you can go with man and say that's crazy, or you can go with God's word and say, somehow this is the case. I just would like to remind you, how much do you know about the world? Here's the answer, not much. I mean, you don't even know your great-grandfather's name. Maybe some of you do. So if my understanding of the world and the universe, both human and angelic, is dependent upon my knowledge and my fellow mankind's knowledge, which only can be received from their empirical senses, I'm just going to say we don't have a hope. But if there is a God who is transcendent and he actually speaks and enters personally into this world such that he might even come and eat with Abraham, we surely do have a hope. Well, I therefore think that this is the pre-incarnate Son of God, who along with and two angels who are concealing their angelic identity, they are these three men. And verse 6 tells us that Abraham hurried, look at verse 6, he hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, hurry, prepare 3 seahs of fine flour. I have done the translation, and that means that it's about 6 gallons. 6 gallons of flour. He commands Sarah, knead it and make bread cakes. Right now, in my world, at lunch, that would have been cornbread. That's not what it was, all right? So you can it's lavash or it's a pita bread or, all right, it's not cornbread, it's not biscuits, all right? So he does go in and he tells Sarah, because he now has seen these three men, and these aren't just ordinary men. He is able to recognize that they have a higher rank than him. And so he now goes in and he tells Sarah in a hurry, we need to honor these three men with a feast. Again, just some things I'm hearkening back to anecdotes from my own life, not because it's special, it's just because I can use it to illustrate things. We were not highbrow. You might have figured that out. And so when we came in for lunch, my grandmother, she is now passed, and most of my family on my father's side has passed. So I think I can say this without being dishonorable. She made biscuits that were like rocks. But you were hungry, so you were grateful. And to be honest, like her field peas, if you don't know what field peas are, they're like peas that grow in the worst soil in the world, and that's where we lived. And so they were like, okay, that works. She can make great field peas. But apart from that, you're just hungry and thankful. What Abraham is coming and telling Sarah to do is not hard biscuits. It's not field peas. Because then look at verse 7. Abram also ran to the herd and took a tender and choice calf and gave it to his young man, and he hurried to prepare it. Now, you probably know, unlike our society, protein is very expensive. Now, we have the world's cheapest protein sources. We have incredible, efficient ways to be able to bring to the hoi polloi like me very good protein at a very low cost. That's not the case for most of the world today. It was not the case for Abraham. So when he goes to his herd and he chooses the best calf, this is a feast. Sarah is making 6 gallons of flour worth of pita bread. And then we are told in verse 8 that he takes curds and milk and brings that would be like yogurt. And that accompanies what he is providing for these guests, all of which is indicating that now Abraham has shifted. He is not only being hospitable to these 3 strangers, rather, he is now honoring them for their apparent high rank. Now, this is not the point of the text, but there is one of the things that we should do. When we come to the Bible and we see in the Bible that there are features in the Bible, and then we look at our own life, we look at our own culture, we look at our own ways of esteeming and valuing things. One of the things that is intrinsic here, and it is a reflection of the way God has ordered the world, there are people and times that the only right thing to do is to honor them. We struggle as a people to honor anyone at any time for anything. Now, many of you in the military have cooked into your life a structure and requirement for honor, and you're better off for it. But generally speaking, we're in a very fast downward slide as a society that we don't actually believe in honoring people. Clearly, that's not what God has planned for Abraham and these 3 guests. All of Abraham's actions in hospitality are to honor these 3 guests. And so in verse 8, we see all of this is achieved, which, just in case you're wondering, let's just like domestically, let's pull back the curtain, right? Was this easy? Do you think they used a crock pot? Were there some dishes? Maybe a mess or 2 was made. And now what's the result? Verse 8, Abraham, he places it before them, and he, that is Abraham, was standing by them under the tree, and they ate. Abraham is, in one sense, the waiter, the servant to these three as they have been seated, and now Abraham with Sarah working in behind the curtain of the tents. They are serving these three men. There now is over food a conversation. And we see in verse 9, they say to him, these three guests say to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? Now, you might remember, we only know that Sarah's name is now Sarah instead of Sarah because we just were told that her name was changed by God in order to remind her that she is a princess because she's going to have a son and kings will come from that son. Nations will come from her. So she's now called princess. How does this man know Sarah's name is Sarah? Who is this? Who is this guest? Abraham responds, there in the tent. I imagine a hand motion was involved in that. Not inspired in the text, obviously, but there in the tent. Now, we spatially are able to learn what? Is Sarah present with these men eating this meal? No. Now, again, I just love to bump in to sort of, cultural sacred cows. This is strange. I was living in Southern California. Grace Community Church had a short-term mission trip in North Carolina. That's weird. And I went on that short-term trip. It gets weirder. We went to Burlington, North Carolina, and we were helping this church plant do a vacation Bible school in the evening. They had a storefront, and right beside the storefront was some kind of martial arts. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about martial arts, but it was a Korean man who had this dojo, and they were evangelizing this Korean man. I don't mean an American who was descendant from Korean people. That's not, this was a Korean man who came to America. He spoke Korean. His wife and his household only spoke in Korean. All of Korea's customs governed this man's house. And so he invited this group to his home. So the funny, like, this is in North Carolina where I'm from, and I'm sitting in this home that is now being, it's using Korean customs to govern how we're going to eat Korean barbecue. And the man's wife stayed in the kitchen because in Korea, at least where this man was from and how they operated, the men and the women didn't eat together. And so it was very unusual. He was going to Lao because there was a bunch of, women and men from California who were guests. They were the guests, so they were going to eat together. And so there was a separation. That's what's happening here, right? We're able to see that we have to pick that up. Where's your wife, Sarah? There in the tent. You got to get that. You got to get that from the text. It's going to be important. And now in the conversation over a communion meal with Yahweh, Abraham, though unaware, verse 10, he, not they, he said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, again, we may think, of course, that's what he says because this is the Bible. And we just read that earlier. No, these are strangers who show up at Abraham's tent, and they now, one of them is able to say, I'm coming in a year, and Sarah is going to be with a son, exactly what Yahweh had already promised to Sarah. So you could maybe imagine the facial, at least in my mind, I'm imagining facial expressions Abraham is having as this man who's obviously revealing himself to be not the guest Abraham thought. But we're told at the end of verse 10, and Sarah was listening at the door of the tent, which was behind him. Verse 11. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Some of you are thinking, like, don't you think, Moses, you're gilding the lily here? I mean, do you need to follow old with advanced in age? Why would you write things like that? Because you're wanting to make sure your readers are picking up what you are laying down. Verse 11 is Moses is writing into the narrative of the event what we need to understand in order to rightly get the point. And then to sort of tack on another degree of death, he says Sarah was past childbearing. So one, what we're able to see very clearly that this man eating at Abraham's table now tells Abraham, Sarah, in a year when I return, will have a son. And Moses wants to make sure, I appreciate this because some of us, like me, we're not the sharpest knives in the drawer. We need it to be explicit. You can't have a son when you are advanced in age. And your wife can't bear you any children when she is past the age of childbearing. Like we just know this. Now, I won't get into it, but in our crazy age, I'll need to make a few things that just, children, you need to understand this. If God made you a boy, it's so that you become a man. And you are to marry a woman. Now, the woman that you marry, at one time, she was a girl. But what happens when a boy becomes a man and a girl becomes a woman? One of the distinctive features of God's design is that that man can now enable his wife, that woman, to bear children. And God, children, get this, is very important in our crazy world. God designed you. Like you physically have been formed by God, outfitted to achieve this. And woman was designed by God to bear children. Everything about a woman is about bearing children. Sarah is beyond the age where she can have children. So there's a window. Now, you might remember Sarah was also barren, so even in her window, she was unable. All of this is to say, in one sense, one commentator said, this is like double death right after the promise of, I'm coming back in a year and Sarah will have a son. Now we get to the point. Verse 12. Sarah laughed. Now, there's different kinds of laughter, isn't there? In case you don't know it, kids, just so you know, your parents know that there's different kinds of laughter. And parents, we also have to know our children learn that there's different kinds of laughter. See, some laughter is like, and I love my dad. He was a big, heavy man. And when he laughed, he wasn't very loud, but his whole body just sort of shook. It makes me happy when you see someone have that kind of like that inner core laughter. You know, there's a number. JC has a beautiful laugh. I love certain people just are gifted with this beautiful laugh. Right? This is not that laugh. See, scoffers laugh. They laugh at God. They laugh at those who believe in God's promises. This is a laugh of unbelief. This is a laugh that actually does not believe what God has promised actually is going to come to pass. Now, it brings up a question. She laughs, verse 12, to herself, indicating that it was either not loud enough so that it would have been a laugh in the context of everyone being able to hear it, or it was not even a laugh that it was out loud, it was just to herself. And she says, after I'm worn out, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? I'll let you parents do the exegesis at home about the details of that one. But what she is clearly doing is she seems to either Abraham did not tell her what the Lord promised. Some commentators think that that is the case, that she is revealing this is the first time that she's heard that she's going to bear a son. Other commentators actually think no, Abraham did tell her and she dismissed what Abraham said. And so in this sense, she's laughing again. Either way, what is happening here is that this promise that Yahweh has made to Abraham regarding Sarah having a son, that Sarah does not believe it. This is a laugh of unbelief. This is a laugh that does not think that God is going to be able to keep his promises. Now stop and consider promises that God has made to you in the gospel. Let me first address a few of these promises, particular to maybe some of you. Number one, to you today who do not believe the gospel, to you who hear my voice right now, and you have not turned from your sin to Christ for forgiveness and to be reconciled to God, listen to me. The promise of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ is that by receiving Jesus Christ, God forgives all of your sins. All of your sins. That means that guilt that you would and should have before God for the evil that you have done to God, he removes it such that there is no guilt with you before God. That is a promise that God makes in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Forgiveness of sins and a conscience that is cleansed by the finished work of his Son. Do you believe it? If you do not believe that, then you, like Sarah, scoff at God. You think that he can't do it, or maybe you think he won't do it. For those of you who refuse to believe the gospel, please do not think that you can paint God into the corner with him not giving you what he clearly promises to you in the offer of the gospel. No, you are painting yourself into the corner. You do not believe his promises. You are the transgressor. It is your unbelief. Not believing the gospel is always a moral issue. Now you can see we could push this into a lot of different areas. Let's take another promise. For good reason, we need to remember Romans 8:28. That God works all things for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Okay, that's actually just a statement. It's a propositional statement of this is what God does for all of his redeemed, for all of his saints. So think right now of the thing that you think, no, this is not working for my good. In fact, this is a problem that needs to be removed from me. And in fact, it is absolutely contrary to my good. You don't believe God's promise. You don't believe that God will do what God says he will do. This is a moral issue. Now, we could take promises and you could see what we could do with them. We could push on them and we could press on them. Sarah here has this particular promise that Yahweh has made regarding her because of his covenant with Abraham, that Yahweh unilaterally has guaranteed it will come to pass. And Sarah, she laughs because she does not believe. Now, I think we would probably be able to, at least I sure am able to, it's like Sarah's explanation for her laughing makes sense to me. Like, if you are promised a son and you are, Sarah says, worn out, and her Lord, that is her husband, he's old, then how are we going to get a son, God? And herein, now we see that though unknown to Sarah in verse 12, verse 13, and here we have the revelation of the guest. Who does verse 13 tell us this guest is? And Yahweh said to Abraham. See, the one who spoke in verse 10 actually is Yahweh. And just to make the connections, which are inferences, Jesus is Yahweh. Yahweh is the triune God. What we just confessed in the Nicene Creed, that God is Trinity, that is a confession that Yahweh is Trinity. And the explanation of the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit that we just read together, that is an explanation, a confession, if you will, of what you believe Yahweh to be, the triune God. And here, if this is the pre-incarnate Son of God, who indeed comes to be the incarnate Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, here we are able to see he is Yahweh. Yahweh now says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Now let's be honest. Isn't it, in one sense, there's a kind of convenience that you can have if the way that you think about God is that indeed, and you could have him framed in all of the orthodox doctrines that we do need to frame God by, but so long as you have him not in your business, it's kind of like, you know, I'm glad I'm with God. And I'm glad God's with me. But that's not the way God works among his people. That's not the way God engages in these covenant relationships of redemption, because now we see literally God is in Sarah's kitchen. She's laughing on the other side of the curtain, and Yahweh says to her husband Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Are you aware, Christian, that when you say, I have a relationship with the triune God through faith in his Son, when I believe the gospel, you now, God is in your business, all of your business, such that when you laugh, God asks why. Now, children, just to be, so you're picking up a few things that is sort of laying down on the patterns. Like when your parents really care about you, when they love you and they understand all that you are, they are not going to be satisfied with external obedience to their commands. Because do you know that if we could sort of unleash the fury of torture, you can make slaves obey. And a slave is not a son. God is not interested in his covenant promises of redemption for there to be some kind of external surface acceptance of his promises and yet laughing about his promises. And so Yahweh is interested in not only that Sarah laughed, he knows it already. He's now interested in shepherding Sarah as to why did she laugh. Now, let's be honest, isn't that both a comfort and a bit of a concern? Isn't it not a comfort to you to know that your God who is in the heavens and who does all that he pleases, that the earth is but his footstool, that he actually is shepherding and caring for you? But isn't it also a little concerning that the Lord himself is shepherding us at the level of our motives and desires? Because if you could see my motives and desires, it'd be pretty ugly, no matter what it looks like on the outside. Well, the Lord knows. And the Lord asks, why did Sarah laugh? And then he says, when she said, shall I indeed bear a son when I am so old? Now, here is the theology lesson. And really, here is the lesson about being in redemptive relationship with Yahweh. Look at the question Yahweh asks in verse 14. Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? Now, this is necessary for us to genuinely consider. Do you have a relationship with God whereby you have categories and you say, God can do these things, but God actually is not able. He lacks the power to do these other things. And the way that you conceive of God's power, if you want to use fancy pants words, his potence. Do you believe that God is omnipotent or omnipotent? Or do you believe, well, he is sorta, but not over here in these realms? Do you believe that God is in control of absolutely everything because of his omnipotence, his power that is infinite without limit? Or do you believe, well, no, he actually can't be powerful over, let's just choose one, the free will of man? Now, that wasn't the particular crux that Sarah had. Her crux was God is not able to make a barren old woman like me with a old lord like Abraham give a son. That was her beef. And so that was what she thought God was unable to do. But the problem that God has with Sarah's thinking is, what does Sarah think about God? What does Sarah think about Yahweh? She thinks something is too difficult for him. Do you think something is too difficult for God? I'll pepper in a few. Do you think that wayward child or grandchild, like he or she, they're too difficult for God? Do you think a certain circumstance, maybe it is that great fearful circumstance that you might rehearse in your mind, that if this happened, you have no idea how you would be able to cope and live in life? And do you think, like, you know what, that would be too difficult for God? Well, whatever it might be for you, for Sarah, we see very clearly, and Yahweh is asking her this problem about what she thinks about him. Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? And then he answers, at the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Now, I find this to be wonderfully gentle in the way God corrects Sarah through Abraham. Sarah is sinning. She's sinning. How does God handle her? He puts his metaphorical finger on the problem with her heart, and it has to do with him, that is God. And he points out, this is your problem, Sarah. It's you think that something is more difficult for me. And what God does not do is he doesn't say, all right, Abraham, let's go get a new one. God's promise is going to triumph. God's promise will not be thwarted. It will not be thwarted even by Sarah's sin. Her unbelief, her scoffing laughter at God's promise is not going to thwart the fact that God has promised that Sarah will be the one to give the son to Abraham. And so he repeats what he has already promised. It now is insistence. Triumphant over Sarah and her unbelief is Yahweh's covenant promise. Now, Sarah, in verse 15, she denies it. You see that? Then Sarah denied it. Now, as much as I would like to think I would be like Abraham in this situation, the truth is that I find myself far more reflected in Sarah. And isn't it true of us? Even when God is able to call us on our sin, God is able to put his finger on the heart that actually is driving this sin, even still, we will deny it. How does the Lord respond to her denial? Now, we are told here that she says, I did not laugh. Straight lie. But what does Moses tell us? Why did she say that? For she was afraid. It's too often the case, isn't it? That we actually do straight lie to God about our sin because we are afraid. See, in the gospel of Jesus Christ, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of actually having to, in one sense, yet again come to the table that reminds you that it is because of the body and blood of the Lord Jesus Christ that was broken and shed for you that you have communion with God? Are you afraid that somehow by your sin that God clearly knows and exposes, that by you actually having to be honest before God about your sin, that he's going to cast you out when he has already shown you his great love for you and sending his son to die for you? Are you afraid that if God actually knew or you admitted your sin, then you would be somehow canceled because the sufficient atonement for all of your sins has been paid for in Christ's death? Like, what are you afraid of? And we're not told what Sarah was afraid of, but we are told that she was afraid, and for that reason, she straight lied to Yahweh. How does Yahweh respond? This might be helpful too. When we lie to God, do we think it works? Some of you kids, you lie to your mom and daddy and you think it works. You may fool them. You can't fool God. What does God say? No. But you did laugh. God doesn't need to ask the creature questions so that God can learn something. God is a shepherd, and therefore, when he asks the creature questions, it's for the creature's sake, not for the creator's sake. We need to understand that God doesn't need to ask us questions so that he can learn anything about us. We need to understand when God asks us questions is because he has something he needs to teach us. Sarah is being taught. You did laugh. Now, you may know this, but we will learn very soon. A son is going to come in a year to Sarah. And she will be told what to name him. Isaac is his name. And Isaac means laughter. One commentator said, well, in relationship between Yahweh and Sarah, who had the last laugh? Yahweh did. Christian, I would like for you to see in this heavenly visit of Yahweh and his angels to Abraham and Sarah. Clearly, salvation, the fulfillment of God's redemptive promises, they are only possible if God keeps them. I would beckon any sinner who hears my voice. Here is the God of the gospel. He demands something from you that only he can provide for you. You do not have the ability, but God does. And that is what he has achieved for sinners like me and you in the giving of his son, his crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, and his return. Do not look to yourself and to your ability, to your wisdom to assess, can God do what he promises? Look to the character of God that is revealed in his relationship with his redemptive people and believe. This is what he has done in Jesus Christ, that ultimate seed of Abraham. If you do not know God, come and talk to me. Come and talk to Tim. Come and talk. Chris will be leaving quickly after church, so don't come talk to Chris. But we really, really want to make sure you understand the gospel. You can be saved. If you are a Christian and you have questions about anything that I've said here, come and talk to me afterwards. Chris will lead us in a song and a benediction.